Hello, and welcome to Blood, Guts, and Social Commentary, as well as another installment of Why Is This a Thing? This will be part one of our look at melt movies. Melt movies are their own little offshot of body horror. Body horror is going to get its own episode eventually, it's going to take me a minute. So for those that are unfamiliar with body horror, it is very quick and dirty, the disintegration of the body to explore taboo themes. Like most subgenres, melt movies have their own little rule set to be considered a subgenre. Number one, people melt. Clear, obvious from the name. Melting must also be the primary means for horror, meaning that the whole horror elements typically come from the fact that people are freaking melting, which typically people shouldn't do. This last point may be a little debatable to others. A lot of people say a single melt does not a melt movie make. In a case like Raiders of the Lost Ark, they're absolutely correct. But Raiders of the Lost Ark was not a horror movie. We did get that end scene with melting, and yes, that could be very horrific to some people, but I do not believe anybody's going to sit here and argue Indiana Jones is a horror movie overall. While it might be horrific to them personally, I don't believe anybody is trying to categorize it as a horror movie for everyone. The reason I have an issue with the one melt does not a melt movie make idea comes into play in our first film, The Incredible Melting Man from 1977. The basic premise is an astronaut is transformed into a murderous, gelatinous mass after returning from an ill-fated space voyage. Some of you may remember this movie from the original Mystery Science Theater 3000, which it rightfully got that treatment. After this man returns back from space, he has this blistered, burned skin, he has this inhuman strength, and then he just starts attacking people. Because supposedly he needs human cells to live off of, feeding off people like a vampire or a zombie. He's also, of course, radioactive because it was 77. Not too crazy far at the atomic age. This murderous rampage leaves him to basically wander around the entire movie, just melting and leaving this almost mucus snail and blood trail for people to find. So anybody that came in contact with him was horrified because they're seeing essentially this melting humanoid being. The Incredible Melting Man essentially did only have one melt. This guy is melting the entire time. But it's horror because this is horrifying. Like, people shouldn't melt. It's terrifying to see that. So this is a movie that had one melt, and it's essentially the first entry into the genre. So that's why I contend that point a little bit. From then on, we do tend to have more than one melt per film, and that's where the idea of consumption tends to come in to the melt movie genre. It isn't necessary, but it tends to be there. Because we move on to 1985 with The Stuff. The Stuff is a delicious, mysterious goo that oozes from the earth and is marketed as the newest dessert sensation. But the tasty treat rots more than the teeth when zombie-like snackers who only want to consume more of the strange substance at any cost begin infesting the world. Now, that might sound really, really heavy-handed, but it gets more and more heavy-handed as we go on. I'd also like to point out this entire film rests on the idea that in the opening of the film is a man walking out, seeing something seeping out of the ground, putting his hand in it, and putting it in his mouth. I know toddlers that don't do that. Not only putting it in his mouth going, this stuff tastes really good, let's mass market it. And there's a whole bunch of weirdness with the FDA. They have a slogan that is enough is never enough. There's industrial spies, there's secret formulas. This is all completely about consumption. They keep pushing that it has no artificial ingredients, so people believe that it is balanced nutrition, so they can eat nothing but the stuff. Which, come on, let's not pretend like that couldn't be reframed now into a very thinly veiled satire on the organic craze. This point about consumption is really driven home with The Stuff by the fact that one of the aliases they decide to use is Frank Herbert. Frank Herbert is the writer of Dune. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to link to a Thug Notes episode about Dune if you haven't read the book. That'll explain more. For a quick, really rough and dirty synopsis, because I'm probably going to end up doing an entire episode on that, even though it's a little out of scope. The entire book rests around a substance called spice. The spice is necessary for pretty much everything, especially space travel. The spice only exists on one world, Arrakis. So all of these noble families control spice, and they basically take turns mining it. There's one that plans to overthrow and take entire control of spice production. So essentially, they are all exploiting this one planet's resource. Since he who controls the spice controls the universe, they also have built in this prophecy to exploit the natives and make them believe that this family should have this power over them. It's also seen as a status symbol because the more spice you have means the more you can afford. And we kind of see that a little bit with the stuff. We see his family switch over to exclusively eating the stuff. While the stuff is never talked about as being overly expensive, it seems like pretty much everybody's eating it. It's still a commodity, just like the spices. So we see this family eating nothing but, and we see in Dune, noble families having spice on everything. You kind of see this little tie-in there. Again, before anybody that's a hardcore Dune fan rages out, I'm going to try and do an entire episode just on Dune and its ties to consumption, because that mythos deserves its own episode. If we skip ahead 2 years, we get to 1987 with Street Trash, which is about a liquor store owner who sells alcoholic beverages to homeless people, hence the title Street Trash, having no chill. But what the liquor store owner is unaware of is that the bottles actually have a toxic brew because he found them out back and just put a buck sticker on them. The first sale is to make this guy go away because he's doing the whole, I don't have any money. You can tell he owes this guy. Liquor store owner wants him to go away, but at the same time is willing to just sell him something cheap to get a profit because scruples, he clearly doesn't have many. The first homeless guy steals a bottle. He ends up getting that stolen from him. Guy drinks it and melts into a toilet because class. The second melt, though, is where the point really seems to be driven home, though, because when he drinks the Viper, which is the toxic brew that's causing these homeless people to melt, he does so with a bunch of business people walking by. So this guy is melting onto these upper crust people in business suits, and they don't even notice him until it hits them literally in the face. They're getting hit in the face with this guy's melted flesh for them to take any kind of notice. So not only does this become commentary on our need to consume, even at our lowest levels, you can argue these people might have become homeless because they had a drinking problem, or you can just argue they're homeless, their lives probably aren't that great, alcohol might just be that bit of escape. It just might be that one thing that gets them through the day. But it's also a comment on how invisible the homeless can be to us until it literally hits us in the face that they're dying. And even then, it's less concern about this man dying and more of a just, ooh, gross, what just hit me in the face. Moving on to 1988's Slime City. A student moves into a rundown building in New York City. His bizarre neighbors make a concoction in their apartment that they call wine, but when he takes some of it, he turns into a deformed, murderous monster. Much like Street Trash, they drink, it makes them melt, this is how it goes, just as it did last time. This one mimics the effects of drugs more, though, before the actual melts occur. Street Trash, it was more of a, you drink, you just melt, that's what happened. This one's more of a process. Their friends actually originally mistake it for drug addiction, and to their credit actually try and intervene and get him off drugs. It just turns out he's not actually on drugs, he's just eventually going to break down and start melting. This one, again, class does play in, because one of the girls that lives in the apartment is a hooker, but she's still living in this very low-end apartment complex that's very run down. And you can still say there's consumption involved because she's essentially selling her body. And that point's really driven home of how devalued she is for that. Because there is a line said that's like, what's the big deal about one missing whore? And she's missing because she was murdered by the guy who's melting, because apparently when you're melting, you murder people unless you insta-melt, because that seems to be where the genre goes. There's also a scene where the guy is talking to his girlfriend, and he says, I love you, Lori, I painted your portrait. And while typically that would probably be seen as a very sweet gesture of This guy had talent and he was using it to show his affection for his girlfriend. When you look at it through the scope of consumption, you see it's like, Lori, I love you. Here's this object to show you I love you, because at the end of the day, here's this tangible thing that may have some intrinsic value to show you I have X amount of affection for you. While that may sound crass if we're looking at everything from a capitalist standpoint when we're looking at this genre. Also in 1988, we got the remake of The Blob, which was a much more mainstream fare than Slime City was, but still a valuable entry into the melt movie genre. This revolves around a strange life form that consumes everything in its path as it grows and grows and grows. This one is pretty upfront from the beginning scene. We open on a high school football game in small town America. You see probably everybody in town at that game. You see everybody at that game with pom-poms. I'm going to bet good money that those pom-poms were a Booster Club drive to get money for that football team. And while that's great and it's awesome that that town is there and supporting their teenagers in whatever endeavor they want to do in their school, that's awesome. It was still, you're giving them money to buy this item to support those kids when you could have just, hey, here's money for uniforms. It's all money for objects and items. Because what purpose is that pom-pom really going to serve aside from going out on a Friday night and waving it around to show this is how much I value my team, I spent money on this, I'm going to wave it around to show my school spirit. But if everybody has one, are you showing really any more school spirit than anybody else? So the next time the Booster Club is doing something, you're going to have to buy the next thing to show you have the school spirit. We cut to a local bar who's dead because everybody's at the football game, except for the small town sheriff coming in to check on the girl who runs the bar. And she points out, doesn't matter if she's dead during the game, everybody's gonna come there after because small town tradition. Again, everybody knows where their money is gonna come from. It's damn near ritualistic at this point. This is where we also establish ski season's coming up. That means tourists. That means this is probably a tourist town. So not only are we looking at small town America, we are looking at a town that most of their revenue for the year is going to come out of a few months. And that is a big plot point in not in just this movie, but a lot of horror movies. I mean, look at Jaws. The whole reason Jaws happened is because, well, they didn't want to shut down the town because of the shark during tourist season, because that's when he's most likely to get the most people. It's a very old horror trope, and it's still very effective because we can understand that. We can understand an entire town not wanting to go under because of this threat. And just like Slime City, a homeless person is the first person affected. Some people do the right thing, get them to the hospital, and the first thing, as anybody who's gone to a hospital in America can attest to, all they care about is the insurance. Because you'd think, somebody's really, really hurt, the first thing we care about is, getting them well. No, the first thing we care about is, how are you gonna pay for us to get you well? And what level of care do you get? Do you get we get you well enough to get out of here, or do we get you all the way there? What level is your insurance going to cover? And it's a sad state of affairs, but that's what it is here. There are several comments about clothing. The mother lets her daughter borrow a cashmere sweater for a date. She's very excited about it being cashmere, which is fair, it's expensive. There's a guy talking about the fabric on a passed out girl's blouse. He's attempting to date rape her, which, to its credit, the blob does stop. I mean, good for the blob. That is kind of nice. As you guys know, I'm not one to advocate murder, but if you're gonna have to kill somebody, an attempted rapist is a good choice. And as the movie continues on, it seems like most people are killed in some way that relates to consumption. There's a cook that's pulled into a sink because the bar stayed open to serve 2 more customers. They didn't have to stay open, but they stayed to make them sandwiches, which was nice. But had they not stayed open to serve those 2 customers sandwiches, the cook wouldn't have been back there cleaning up later and probably wouldn't have been pulled into the sink. There's a theater projectionist that gets it while they're checking the AC vent. While most people don't consider air conditioning a luxury, in a lot of places it still is. His comfort which I get projection rooms are hot. I get it. For some areas, it would be miserable to live without air conditioning. I get it. I don't like being hot either. But both him and his manager get it while just trying to check the same freaking AC vent. And their screams are both covered up by this Friday the 13th knockoff horror film, which I'm sure is a nice little nod to, well, maybe they could have heard the screams had this blatant knockoff ripoff not been playing. Because it was 88 and we were in that big horror boom of every single thing looked exactly the same, and it was oversaturated at the time. Everybody knew that. Another person gets it because they're talking in the theater, which, while that is nice, can't stand theater talkers. It again relates to consumption because movies are still expensive. Like, even back then, they were kind of expensive. So, you've got an audience full of people that paid good, hard-earned money. You got this jagoff talking all through it. The Blob took care of that. Blob almost gets a kid because his jacket gets caught in the door. The government wanted to weaponize the Blob. That's, like, where this whole thing came from. So, basically, it was the military-industrial complex that created this thing and was going to threaten to destroy this small town, and the government was going to let it. Just because this small town was worth destroying over the Blob taking over everything, which I get minimizing damage, but at the same time, it's like, okay, so this weapon you were trying to build, you let loose in this very small town, and it's going to kill all these people. Is there any amount of money you can make that would be worth, like, just totally wipe your small town off the map? Think about that logically for a minute. How do you get from there to here? Like, how do you get from, we're gonna make all this money, to this entire town dies for us to make all this money? And, like, morally speaking, that just doesn't seem like a place you should be going ever. And ending the 80s is 1989 with Society. An ordinary teenage boy discovers his family is part of a gruesome orgy cult for the social elite. Once again, no chill. Society lays it out in its intro music and its title, what it's going to give you. But where there is commentary about the wealthy elite, there is definitely commentary about frivolous consumption. His girlfriend, his parents, his sister only care about parties. Even when one of their friends dies, all his sister cares about is what he's going to wear to the next party. And it takes this extreme social decorum. There's a formal invite, and I mean like gold leaf sent by a messenger. I've seen wedding invites that didn't look this nice to a high school party. And by high school party, I mean in like a kegger. And it's just like, who does that? I didn't grow up in a very affluent area. Maybe there are some places that do that, but yeah, if you're just having your buddies over, who does that? There's always these pushes about contribution to a society, about good breeding, and the good breeding takes a very dark turn when there are massive hints at incestuous relationships, which, if you know anything about history, there's a pretty decent lineage of cultures doing that, of higher society breeding within themselves to keep the bloodlines quote-unquote pure, which, as we know now, and even somewhat back then, leads to degradation and deformities down the line, both mentally and physically. It's really not that great of an idea. But the end is really what hits home for this movie about consumption. Spoiler warning if you have any interest in seeing it. I'd also suggest skipping over this part if you're easily grossed out. Basically, these people, when it said orgy at the beginning, their definition of an orgy is becoming these weird, almost, I guess I would refer to it almost as insect-like animals they get. You know how when you see a fly and it has that little sucker coming off of it? They kind of have that where they suck, literally, stuff out of people. There's a guy that's turned completely inside out by them going up through his anus into his mouth and like pulling inside out. And during this, quotes are given like, the rich have always sucked off low-class shit like you. There's mentioned slave revolts. Essentially, these high-class people are literally sucking off the poor. People that they view as less than them, even if they're technically not, they could be affluent, they just need to view them as less. They leech. They will come and they become this like hot, sweaty mess and they melt, essentially. But it's different from what we've seen in the past. They melt, but it's almost like a silly putty where they can morph and blend and become one with each other, and that's where the incest kind of came in, where we saw our main characters, mother, father, and sister kind of all blend in together as one unit. It's very hard to explain if you haven't seen the film. And I don't want to show pictures because I don't want to spoil it for those that are bypassing this. I highly suggest you watch it to just even begin to understand what I'm talking about. But they do become these massive blobs, and the orgy, because there definitely is a sexual component to it, but it's more, you don't really know where one person begins and the other person ends. They just kind of meld together in this weird blob. But they can all come back out of it and become human-shaped again. So that's really what they're talking about when they say orgy. And that's what constitutes this as a Melt movie. While it has all the commentary a Melt movie does, it doesn't technically become a Melt movie until the very end. And that's what makes it clearly defined horror film. Before then, people could call it like mystery or a thriller or sci-fi because you don't really know what the hell's going on. So what do you think? Are Melt movies nasty social commentary on consumption? Do you think I'm way off base here? Do you want to wait until part 2 to decide? As always, leave your thoughts, opinions, comments down in the comments section. And if you like what you're hearing, please hit like, comment, subscribe. If you don't like what you're hearing, I'm all ears. Thank you for listening.